Hi, everybody. I'm back again. And yeah, feeling a little bit better than yesterday for sure. Alrighty. So uh, I'm going to start off by, first apologizing for yesterday. I was really, really not well. But I just wanted to get I just wanted to get the chapter out. Partly because I wanted to know what happens next. And if I didn't read it to you guys, I'd be reading it to myself, and that would be cheating. It would be cheating. So here I am with ambient sound in the background. I'm sorry. I'm going to just ignore the air conditioner in the back, and I will do what I can to speak over it and be louder and enunciate. Anyway, so where I'm at right now is there are 18 chapters in this story as it sits. And so basically, I'm currently, as of yesterday, I am a third of the way through. I wanted to do a little bit of a seeing how I feel. It's kind of funny because with there only being 18 chapters, what I will do is also later on this week on Thursday, I'm going to be talking about, which is only 2 chapters away now. Um, I'm going to go over the halfway point. Like I'm going to be at the halfway point on Thursday. So then I'll be reviewing again halfway point where I feel the story is right now. Being a third of the way through and not having a clear idea of what his overarching goal is really makes me feel uneasy. Like it's great if at the end, if towards the end we find out more about what's going on, because there's a bunch of different plot points that seem to be they're there and they need to get resolved. I mean, that's a promise I feel that has been made to me. So things need to start wrapping up. Well, not wrapping up now, but like there needs to be more build of what's going on with everything. I feel. Um, I feel like also we just start added a bunch more story without resolving anything else or starting to have more more steps towards a climax of everything else that's going on. So I'm not sure. It just there's a lot. There's a lot, and I don't know. Like I said, I'm hoping that I'll know better by the midpoint, by like literally halfway through the book, physically, not necessarily like plot wise. I'll have a clearer understanding of what's going on, and I mean, yes, you know what's going on, but I mean, so anyway, without that, thank you for letting me ramble a bit there. But that's what I feel like the book is doing. The book is rambling right now. There's a lot of information being given to us, and there doesn't seem to be anything being built on to like continue the story. So let us see what happens in chapter 7. And hopefully there's more information. Yeah, I'm hoping. Anyway, so, and I guess I just leaned right in there without introducing myself. But if I'm introducing myself, it means that you guys need to go back. If you've never sat in on this show before, go back and watch previous broadcasts so you can kind of get an idea of what the story is. Because I'm currently chapter 7 out of an 18 chapter story that I'm reading of my dad's manuscript. While I'm also here, I'm also going to be, and I have my head down a lot, so I may not be able to answer your questions right away, but I might look up afterwards and try and like scroll through everything and give answers as I can because I'm have my head down. I'm trying not to. I try to look more up at the camera and talk more to you guys than to the page, but sometimes partway through these stories, there's a lot more marker going on because I'm marking up for editing. In this case, there might be restructuring going on. I'm not sure. Like, it's either going to be really, really cool and climatic, or else it's going to be me doing a lot of restructuring to make it like that. Anyway, without further ado, Chapter 7 of The Dance of 100,000 Steps. Don't open that barricade! The lieutenant shouted. It seemed like a callous order, leaving soldiers trapped on the other side of the barricade with the mob, but I agreed. Behind the barricade, we had some chance. Open even a part of the barricade and we were done. To back this up, the sergeant bellowed, I'll kill any man who tries to open the barricade! Muskets up and prepare to fire! The running soldiers hit the barricade. Those who could master their panic began to climb. Others briefly and often faded. Others paused briefly and often fatally. Fire! The sergeant's order rose over the din. A crash of volley of musket fire covered the mob noise momentarily. Gray powder smoke billowed out from the barricade. Fire! Given the time it took to reload a musket, the usual practice was to divide the force in two, 3 if there were enough, so that you could have a volley being fired every few seconds. Depressingly few of the fleeing soldiers made it over the barricade. Some, moving the wrong direction at the wrong time, were even killed by our own muskets. No few of the soldiers, once over the barricade, kept on going. I noticed an interesting fact here. Most of the ones who stopped after getting over the barricade were also the ones who had held onto their own arms. With them joining in defense, we finally threw the mob back. It was a tense time, though. Some of the soldiers met them with bayonets. Others were able to keep up regular volley fire. A musket is not the most accurate of weapons, but at point-blank range, into a dense mob, each round was likely to hit someone. Often more than one. In hand-to-hand fighting, a pitchfork and a bayoneted musket may have about equal range, and a lot depends on the agility of the user. Steady infantry, especially behind some kind of cover, can usually best a mob. I had a sword in one hand and an empty pistol in the other. Pitchforks outranged my sword. But on the other hand, my sword was much more maneuverable, and I was trained in its use. Though in open ground, I'd bet myself with a pitchfork against a man with a sword. I've had special training. Behind a barricade, my mobility was restricted, but I had the advantage of the cover it offered. Mostly what I did was to thrust at faces distorted with hate, slip the pitchforks or whatever aside with my blade, and thrust again. They finally pulled back. One might have hoped we'd stopped them, quenched their thirst for blood, but muskets began to fire from doors and windows along the street. These bullets seldom did more than fling splinters of wood from the boxes or wagons that made up the barricade, or thump into the filled sacks that reinforced it. However, they did make movement a little more dangerous. Not that musket fire was accurate at any sort of range, as I remarked, but an accidental hit is still a hit. They'd taken over the building down where the street curved, a 3-story affair, so they could use plunging fire against us, which almost overcame our advantage in being behind the barricade. Who's senior officer here? The lieutenant called out. There was no answer. No officers? I was next to him as it began to sink in that he was in command and all the decisions were up to him. Senior soldier from the main body, step forward. That required a bit of looking around until one fellow, tough looking, showing a bit of gray in his hair, stepped forward. Musketeer Harder, Talclads, sir. Report, Musketeer. What happened? Sir, I don't rightly know. They had more muskets than anyone thought. They just started moving back when they came down one of those little alleys, rushed us and overran the rear guard. They were all over us. And then things went bad, sir. I heard shouts of, "Turn and make ready! Fire! And save yourselves!" Some were doing one thing, some were doing another. We never had time to form rightly. Ended up we legged it here, sir. I could almost see the lieutenant thinking accusations about desertion of their officers, and willed him not to waste time with useless recriminations. Again, he showed his capability. Among you, any among you seriously hurt? I doubt it, sir. Anyone at badly at all badly hurt, they were probably caught by those vicious buggers. Right. Lieutenant pitched his voice to be heard by all. I'm Lieutenant Cad Tellum. I'm in command here. Sergeant Darthar is second to me. We've got orders to hold this barricade until reinforcements arrive. That's what we will do. The sergeant will number you off in threes to allow short breaks by numbers as circumstances permit. Be ready to get back to the barricades if they attack. Sergeant, take over. Yes, sir. If he survived, Lieutenant Cad Talon had a future in front of him. Suddenly in charge of the smashed remnants of a regiment, he wasn't panicking. Attempting withdrawal would bring the enemy down on us as soon as they saw what was happening. Much better to use advantage of the barricade. He also had the intelligence to let his sergeant take charge of most things. An older man, probably a veteran of several fights, Sergeant Darthar's advice would be invaluable. Lieutenant, I said, I hope he takes hints from me as well. Yes. He turned a steady gaze on me. They overran the main body by circling around and coming up the alleys. They might be able to do the same here. His nostrils flare. I have little under 100 men here. I can't split them up to block every alley. No, sir. I just suggest you keep men in some of the buildings beside and behind us to make sure they don't try and chop their way through. And perhaps build a second barricade just behind this one. And the men who do it, and those men wow, okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to read the sentence. And the men who do it, and those who man it, their backs will be exposed from fire from the upper stories of the buildings down the street. He was just making a comment, not an objection. He turned to Sergeant. Sergeant Darthar, when you're done assigning the men, report to me, please. Sir. Our situation was not altogether hopeless. We had a good, strong barricade, a force of trained and disciplined men facing a mob with nothing much beyond fervor and numbers. When I thought about it, I had a lot of sympathy with the mob, fighting to overthrow a government that gave them only rules and laws and punishment. However, I was trying to get out of the spy business and into more legitimate business, even if the lieutenant hadn't picked the street in front of my barns to make his barricade. The mob wouldn't have left me with much as they rampaged that direction. Worst of all, there was a royal prince involved. No matter what the mob thought, once Prince Konvuk had won, he would put his heavy hand on the people, leaving them as badly off as before. As I asked the lieutenant, are we expecting relief anytime soon? He gave me a suspicious look that apparently decided that I had put myself in the same boat as he. All I know for sure is we were told to hold for the 76th Battalion to come up and reinforce us with guns. To properly answer your question, when do we expect them? I'd guess not sooner than the middle of tomorrow morning. It was a guess, of course. His senior officer would have just told him to fall back, make a barricade so they could hold out for the 76th Battalion and wait for the rest of the regiment to join him. That was as far as Lieutenant Cad Talon's orders took him. Then everything went to hell in a hot pitch on everyone. The mob has cannon? They had one, but they seem to be low on shot, and they probably have another one, and plenty of shot, if they overrun ours, as it seems. And the one that blew up? He shrugged. We had two. So they may be bringing at least one against us shortly? Yes. I'd best get the men to pad the front of the barricade, take up most of the shock of the cannonballs. There seem to be a lot of muskets out there. He glowered. Yes, Konvok has opened the arsenal to them. They've probably got more muskets than men who can properly use them. I have an idea if you don't mind trusting me. Tell me your idea and I'll see. I slip out this evening and disable their gun or guns. He looked at me suspiciously. I wouldn't want to try that with half a platoon, and you're going to try that alone? What have you got to lose except one man? Or perhaps you just feel your chances are better with them? I shook my head. If there are reinforcements coming with guns, the insurrection is done. Why would I put myself on the losing side? This left aside all questions as to how loyal the rest of the army were. But I wasn't about to bring that up when I was trying to convince him to let me do something on my own. I could tell he didn't like to be. Okay, let's try that again. I could tell he didn't like allowing anybody under his command, no matter how nebulously so, to go wandering off on a mission so fraught with risk and so unlikely to succeed. Watch this, I said. I took the pistol off my belt and tossed it high into the air. Without taking my eyes off his face, I caught it on the way down. I, okay. A trick, I told him. One of a number of tricks I know. And some of those tricks involve slipping around at night and doing unexpected things. If I had your permission, I could go out and quite possibly do us some good. I was fairly sure that I could even slip away without permission, but that would be much better if I was authorized. His mouth tight, he considered the matter. I realized that the thought of my being able to slip away without permission might have just occurred to him. Finally, he nodded his head sharply. All right, let me know before you go. We'll arrange for passwords. Sergeant Darthor, when I got a chance to talk to him privately, was a little more rude about the Crown Prince's action. We know for sure he's a royal prince now because he's buggered us royally. Only good thing I can see is that he's broken up some of his regiments among the mob to stifle them, rather than keeping them all together to provide one solid force. And apparently the lots that's facing us is just supposed to keep us busy, while the main thrust is toward Drafster. The king is at Drafster? No. The sergeant smiled at the prince's miscalculation. He was supposed to be there, but he suddenly took a notion to move, just after the prince marched, and just before the prince turned coat. Maybe old daddy suspected something was coming? There was a shout from the barricade. Cannon! They're bringing up a cannon! We had one slight advantage. The bend in the street was near enough to be within far musket range, which meant that we could harass the gunners while they were setting up and between shots. Lieutenant Cadtellen took advantage of that and had his men firing at the gunners. It takes a good deal of luck to hit someone with a musket at a range like that. However, about 50 muskets firing, there was enough luck around. Good luck for us, bad luck for the gunners. Of course, if you're down there trying to get a cannon set up, and musket balls are flying around you and smacking off the cobblestone and barrel of your gun, your morale is not going to be high. They eventually brought a crowd of musketeers around the corner to return our fire. We, of course, were behind cover, so we didn't quite suffer so badly as they. The first cannonball smashed a bite out of the top of our barricade. I could hear roars of approval. It wasn't serious yet, but a couple of shots could make our situation difficult. The next ball from the cannon went just overhead. No one down there was really an expert at gun laying. At gun laying? Sure. Perhaps, too, the knowledge that our fire was concentrated on the gun made the gunners less enthusiastic and less careful at their task as well. The third shot ricocheted off the cobbles, but still had the force to make a hole in the top of the barricade. The crowd roared louder. The fourth shot was hit dead on, sending splintered barrels and contents of sacks flying. It also left a chest-high gap, about 3 feet wide. The crowd roared again and were on our way toward us. We were saved by the fact that they weren't patient enough to wait for the cannon to destroy the barricade, or at least make it much less defensible, as they spread out across the street, blocking the fire of the cannon. This assault was no more organized than the first had been. Most of those in the crowd who had muskets discharged them within the first few steps, though the people who had been in the upper floors of the houses continued to fire over their heads. Given the range and their nominal skill, it was no surprise that we suffered as few casualties from the musket fire as we did. On our part, however, the soldiers continued a steady volley from the time the mob came within reasonable range. Smoke rapidly obscured everything farther away than about the length of a musket barrel. The soldiers continued to fire into the smoke, aiming low. Any hits would be accidental, but a man catching a ball in the chest was just as dead, whether it was aimed or fortuitous. Rage and determination carried the insurrectionists all the way up to the barricade, despite terrible losses. After that, it was hand to hand. The ragged figures loomed up out of the smoke, wild-haired men with screaming faces, brandishing whatever weapon they had. A blast of musketry at point-blank range. Then we were fighting for our lives. I fired my pistol into the face of a man with a bayoneted musket, batted a pitchfork aside with my sword, then thrust for once, at the same time dodging something coming at me from the left. A thrown cobblestone rang off the metal tire of a wagon wheel, and a figure holding a cleaver in his hand clawed his way up the barricade far enough for a swing. I thrust and turned, realizing just as the sword went home that it was a woman. Well, old Holton had said, one day you might find yourself. Wow, okay. Yeah, there we go, actually. Yeah. I have to read for sensitivity. And I mean my own sensitivity, because he's a man of a time. And there's just some things that I'm going to be changing and that I don't agree with, so that I'm going to have to change. But this one is not that. One day you might find yourself fighting against a woman. Don't hold back. She can kill you just as dead as any man could. In fact, I'd had to kill women before. I have a scar. Well, never mind. The thing is that in a situation like this, there's no time to break down and cry, even if I had been that way inclined. The mob didn't care whether I was killing men, women, children, or cuddly little puppy dogs. There was a bayoneted musket thrusting at me again. I knocked that aside with my sword and thrust in turn. The fellow with the musket fell away before my thrust reached him. I wasn't sure whether he'd been hit by a musket ball or by one of our soldiers or what. Then they were gone, the last of them disappearing into the fog of powder smoke that obscured the street. I cleaned my sword, noting a nick in the blade. Musket barrel? Pitchfork? Or what? Who knew? And what was the difference? I reloaded my pistol carefully and tucked it back into my belt. I don't even know. Okay. The cannon continued to boom sporadically. Serving the gun was a dangerous job, though, with our own musketeers continuing to fire at the cannon, in the general direction of the cannon, rather. The haze of the smoke trapped by the buildings meant that visibility was pretty much nil. That worked both ways, though. They couldn't see us from the cannon where the cannon was sighted, which meant they were firing blind. Every discharge of the cannon added to the haze as well. Still, balls smashed into and through the barricade more often than was safe for such a small force as ours. Lieutenant Cad Tellin had men lugging stuff to firm up the barricade nearly continuously. Mattresses or filled sacks were the favored thing for a barricade that was to stand up to cannon. This, of course, at this range, any benefit of sorts of that, any benefit these sort of things gave was limited. Night came. Muskets continued to bang from time to time down there, as well as the cannon. Our own men continued to fire, occasionally mostly in the direction of the cannon. I approached the lieutenant. I think it's time I went out. He looked at me. Yes, I'd mentioned it to him before, but he still wasn't happy with the notion. They'll keep up the fire with the cannon, and by morning they'll have knocked loopholes in the walls of the houses halfway up the street. Getting rid of the cannon will only be part of the solution to the problem of their firepower, but it should keep them from being quite so eager. He nodded. I was saying such things that must have been occurring to him, but he didn't like the idea much. I wonder if it was the fact that if I went out there, I'd be a factor beyond his control, and he wouldn't be able to take me into his calculations properly. Finally, he nodded. All right, get yourself ready. We'll arrange watchwords for our people so you won't be shot coming back. Could be interesting. So, wearing a dark shirt with a coil of rope across my shoulders, and my boots hung around my neck, I went out that night. It was a fairly easy trick to let myself out of the window, get up to the roof, jump across to the next house, and so on down to the end. It was simpler to get up on the roof from the side where their cannon was situated, which was a bit of an advantage. On the other hand, pardon me, if there was anyone down there with a military sense of a turnip, they'd have had their roofs guarded. Could I deal with guards without alerting people down below? Well, if I couldn't, I shouldn't be trying this. One observation I made immediately was that the tendency in Uprush was to have roofs built on a slightly steeper slant than Freyant or even Brigantia. I put the dance in charge of my balance and went on. The desultory musket and cannon fire. It was not going to be easy to hear me until I got fairly close anyway. Not that I went stomping around feeling safe, mind you, but I was aware of my advantage. I was aware, too, that it worked both ways. I couldn't hear some of the more subtle noises myself. I had a bad moment down 2 houses away from the site of the gun when my landing, as light as it was, sent a slate sliding off the roof to clatter on the ground. Skilled sneaker around, knowledgeable in the dance or not, I had no control over facts such as some slate on some roof slide being loose. As it turned out, it was one of those lucky turns I have on occasion. Someone down below shouted, "Is that you bouncing around, Galf?" Galf, about 3 yards away in the darkness, answered, "No, not me. Just a loose slate somewhere, from the noise of the cannon." He wasn't even worried enough to go see whether something other than noise had loosened the slate, which meant he wasn't the kind of guard I had to worry about. One could even see the logic in his attitude. Sure, I'm up here to guard against somebody coming across the roofs, but they haven't got people down there to send across roofs, so why worry? I put a lot of caution into my next moves. Eventually, I could make out Golf sitting astride the roof, leaning back against the chimney, musket across his knees. The dance teaches patience. I moved slowly, a foot, an inch at a time, never enough for Golf to catch sight of me. Every time I looked off in another direction, I moved, just a bit. Most of his time was spent looking directly along the edge of the roof, as if the people who came would be tiptoeing along it, with their hands outspread like wire walkers at the fair. At last, I was so close he was likely to notice me, no matter how careful I was. I went the last few feet in a rush, hitting him in the solar plexus before he could shout, then smacking his head against the chimney twice. I caught his musket before it could go sliding down the roof, then paused. "Gelf, are you doing some kind of dance up there?" I answered, trying to sound as much like Gelf as possible. "No, just shifting around a bit. These tiles are all hard on the arse." "Well, with all the racket you're making up there, I figured you scared anybody away who might be coming." The military sense of a turn-up would require that someone down below come up to check on Golf. I sat quiet for a moment, waiting and listening. Nothing. I had had several possible notions in my mind for dealing with the cannon, but with the present situation with me now, processing a musket, possessing a musket, allowed another possibility. First thing to do was to put in more powder, a good deal more powder. Then put in a lot of balls as well. And on top of that, a huge wad made of Gelf's shirt. I took a strip of the same shirt, tied a slip knot around the trigger and trigger guard, so that when the knot tightened, the musket would fire. I wrapped a considerable length of cloth remaining around the musket barrel, joining just above the firing pan, then tied that to the end of my coil rope. A tug on that would unroll the cloth, and when it was unrolled, pull the slip knot tight. I could see where the cannon was. The occasional bang and flash of its firing revealed it pretty well. Putting myself on the far side of the chimney, I unrolled a fair quantity of rope, cocked the musket, and tossed it up and out. It was one of those things I had to do by best judgment. But what I felt was at the right moment, when the musket had disappeared in the gloom, I jerked the rope. The bang from below was more than just the bang of a musket firing, and as I'd hoped. The explosion of the blocked musket set off some of the powder charges ready for the cannon. The house I was on rocked and began to settle at the corner where the gun had been. I coiled my rope and started back. The trip back was a lot easier, since all the attention was on where the cannon had been. If I'd done nothing more than blow one of its wheels apart, it was still out of action. I considered tapping a sentry on the shoulder and telling him the password, but that kind of showing off seldom pays. I did things the approved way and soon was talking to Lieutenant Cad to tell him. "We heard the explosion, and the gun hasn't fired since. I take it you were successful?" I have every reason to believe so. I couldn't check closely, but the explosion dropped one corner of the house near a foot. I'd say it would have had to put the gun out of operation, too. As morning came over the still slightly hazy street, we could see, vaguely, that the cannon was canted at an angle, one of the wheels broken. They can't fire it like that, the lieutenant said. It likely do them as much harm to them as it does us. What did you do? I explained my little contrivance with Gelf's musket. When I was done, he continued to look at me for a bit. Just a guess, or do you have a flair for extempor- extemporaneous planning? Extemporaneous planning, sir. Not that I say I have a flair to it, but this blah, extemporaneous plan worked, didn't it? It took a while for the insurgents to organize. As I'd predicted, they'd already taken over the buildings halfway down the street and knocked loopholes in the walls. As the light improved, they began shooting. Under the sergeant's direction, our own men began shooting back. I didn't bother telling the lieutenant this was all probably a prelude to an attack. He knew that as well as I did. Then a line of men appeared out of the smoke down in front of the insurgents' barricade. They advanced in somewhat a ragged line, then dropped to one knee and fired. The volley was not entirely simultaneous, but near enough so. Another line advanced through the smoke, moved a few steps down the street, knelt and fired. A third line advanced, knelt and fired. By this time they were almost halfway to our barricade, and the fire from our own troops caused severe casualties among them. Now through the haze in the street, the attack came. It was the same shouting, screaming, wild mob, but some of the ones carrying muskets managed to avoid discharging them until they were close. Really? Most of us ducked back momentarily, and in that moment, they were scrambling up the barricade. Most of the soldiers by now had 2 or 3 loaded muskets at their positions, and were able to fire point blank into the mob before they fell hand to hand. It was much the same as before: parry, thrust, cut, parry, and continue. Huge men with clubs, smaller men clumsily wielding bayoneted muskets, people with knives, pitchforks. They came and they came and they came. A soldier came out of the barn shouting, "Sir, they're chopping through the wall! Sergeant, 5 more into the barn!" Sergeant grabbed 5 men and sent them on their way. I followed them, the barn being of some concern to me. The first axes had appeared through the walls when we got there. I suspected they'd been cutting through the walls most of the night, working with as much quiet as they could manage. When they got here to the wall, they were ignoring quiet in favor of speed. I considered ordering the soldiers to shoot through the walls, but that was unlikely to be effective. Wait a bit until it was sure that where the axemen were, then fire. Of course, I wasn't in charge. The sergeant was, and he, older soldier that he wasn't about to waste any bullets. "Make ready," he said. With no fumbling, his men saw to their priming and stood waiting. When they start coming through the wall, we can see what we're up against. I'll give the order to fire. And I don't want to see any of you squeeze a trigger until I say so. The horses, knowing that something was going on, started neighing and kicking at their stalls. Great chunks of board in the wall gave way, letting us see movement beyond. Fire! The sound of muskets was loud in the closed barn. Wood splintered from the wall, and men on the other side shouted and screamed. There was a ragged roll of musketry on the other side of the wall. Splinters flew, and 2 soldiers went down. Bayonets forward! The wall, chewed by musket balls and axes, began to sag. As part of it began to fold down from a still solid wall stud, and a huge axeman stamped it down and came through. He was met with a bayonet immediately. The only the only thing that really saved us was the size of opening they'd made. It let about 4 men at a time, just enough for us to deal with. Not that we've dealt with them easily. They were wild and fierce and determined, and some of them had muskets too. Some of them even managed to hold on to enough sense to reload their muskets and fire past their fellows in front before the press behind them forced them up into the hand-to-hand stance distance. I took a few powder burns, but was always able to shift away at the last moment, just enough for the ball to miss. A lot of soldiers with me weren't so lucky. The soldiers used their bayonets well, even in this shouting, shrieking din, with the frightened horses adding to it. The men didn't lose their training. The mob, of course, hadn't had the training. Sometimes one of them might get lucky. We had to hold them right at the wall. If we let enough of them in to push us back at all, we certainly weren't enough to watch on all sides. Of course, nobody was saying anything like this. Possibly few, but me even thinking it, we just stood and fought. Bat a weapon aside, thrust, parry, parry, thrust, and keep moving. Shortly, the pile of bodies made it more difficult for them to come through. Not impossible, just difficult. Then the attack was over. A last few were staggering back through the smoke, and soldiers took the opportunity to load their muskets again. There was me, the sergeant, and 2 others still standing. The others were lying on the barn floor, several of them obviously dead. A gap in the wall was choked with dead and dying. Sir? The sergeant spoke a little diffidently. Would you mind looking out the door and seeing how things are going out there? I went and looked. Soldiers were slumping in their positions at the barricades, a haze of smoke over everything. The enemy were no longer in evidence there, save for dead littering the street. They've been pushed back out there as well, Sergeant. Good. Then he spoke to his men. You two keep watch here, in case they come again. I'll report to the lieutenant. I went out too. The attack out there had been a fierce one as well. Had clearly came near to destroying us. We'd survived though, and survival was sufficient for the time being. I needed to know how the situation stood. There were still scattered shots coming at us from those loopholed houses. But given the smoke in our barricade, there was more frustration behind them than real intent to kill. I waited until the sergeant had finished his report, then walked over to the lieutenant. I had had sufficient time to view the situation. The numbers of men standing at their posts, despite wounds that ought to have earned them a place in some sheltered rear. Can we hold again? He looked at me, filthy and tired he might be, but there was still determination there. We'll have to. Word is that some of them have filtered around us and could be coming down on our rear any time now. Just as well there isn't a lot of military sense out there. They won't be able to manage another frontal attack soon. If they'd held off until people behind us had attacked us, our condition would have been worse. He smiled, still grim. Come here, look out there. Yes, carefully, one of those idiots might have too much luck. You see the ones with the green trousers? Those are uniform trousers. They probably took off their coats so as not to have any mistakes made in the course of the fight. Those are the ones who did advance the fire and made it as near as it was. Traitors. I didn't bother to point out to them that they're more likely men who had just followed the orders of their officers, given on behalf of the man who had really been the traitor. The common soldier's choice had been no simple one. Disobedience to the command of the superior could result in summary punishment. I thought I'd held my face expressionless, but apparently something showed. Or perhaps he read something that wasn't there. You don't agree? You have some sympathy for that lot? A bullet smacked into the edge of the firing port in the barricade, threw out a spray of splinters, and ricocheted to catch Lieutenant Cad Tellon in the right arm, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. I dropped to a knee beside him, ripping his clothing away. The humerus was not just broken, but shattered. With what was at hand, I splintered the arm and bandaged it, not sure whether he'd have much use of the arm, or indeed whether he'd have the arm at all. But that was for more skilled people than I. When I was done, I looked up to find the sergeant and two senior soldiers looking at me. A bad one, sir? Bad. I don't think you'll bleed to death, but the arm is in trouble. I think you're in command. No, I wasn't going to try and take over this fight. For one thing, I wasn't anywhere in the chain of command, and it wasn't going to be a good thing for me to suddenly start issuing orders. Who'd obey, and who'd look to the sergeant first? Right. He looked around at his badly battered command and began issuing orders. Far down the street behind us came the sound of musketry. We're about to be relieved if we don't get run over first. The sergeant barked out more orders that put the bulk of men at the barricade behind to our rear, while the rest were to keep watch out front. Sure enough, out of the smoke and haze to our rear came a scatter of ragged men, none of them armed. The volley from the barricade was ragged as well, and the sergeant cursed violently. Oh, hell and great stinking lumps of hot pitch. Who gave you the order to fire? Our relief will be out there too. Stand by with bayonets. The haze of smoke gradually began to give way, and out in the street were vague figures of people rushing into houses. They might or might not be able to get at back doors or windows or smash holes in walls, but they were done fighting. From behind them came the sound of pipes. Sure, pipes. I'm sure it's a word. It's one I have to look up. And drums playing a march. King Hargle crosses the brook. Our relief had arrived, and the insurrection was as good as over. Okay, so that was chapter 7. You can tell it's more military flavor than I was expecting. And when you're expecting more of a fantasy, I'm feeling a little bit let down. Like, there was a wizard. What happened to the wizard? I mean, we're still like just a little past a third of the way through. So there's still more to the story. And I'm beginning to get an idea. He did make a mention. There was a mention in this chapter of him wanting to put his spy life behind him. Yeah, so I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to do more reading tomorrow. Tomorrow I'm going to actually, and I said Thursday at the beginning of this stream, but now I'm saying a little bit different. I think that if I do this right, I can get, well, they're going to be longer. There's going to be longer sessions. That's all there is to it. But I can probably get 9, 10, 11. Yeah, so I'm going to see what doing 3 chapters tomorrow looks like. So it might be a lot longer of a stream, which might be nice for some people because they longer streams are usually better. I just kind of want to see if I can try and accelerate this book so I can get through more of it. Um, because I have a feeling that this one's going to need some heavy edits in order for me to be able to, in order for me to like make it worth publishing. So I appreciate everyone who is tuning in tonight and listening to me ramble and read. And it's mostly reading because I just, yeah. But there's some really great premises in this book, and I just want to like, I want them to shine, but I need to finish reading the rest of the book so I know what it is I need to fix. Fix. I mean, I'm sure everybody already has stuff that they're like screaming, like, you know. So maybe that's something that you can like pop in the chat tomorrow night, because tomorrow night I will do that. I will say, guys, feel free to pop in and tell me what you think so far. Tonight's probably not the night for it because I just finished reading. But maybe that's what you can do tomorrow night is let me know what you think. Is there anything you would change about it? Because I know there's some things I would change. But I want to see like the rest of the story too. So that may be another thing too. Is that maybe we'll go through the rest of the story and then we'll have a wrap up and we can all go together and say what we feel about the story. Because I have feelings. Anyway, thank you everybody for tuning in. Thank you for sitting around and listening to the story. And yeah, I will talk to everybody tomorrow. So have a good night.